4 hours and 17 minutes. That is how long it took the People's Liberation Army to reduce a democracy of 23 million people, one of the most connected, most technologically sophisticated societies on Earth, to digital silence. At 11:43 p.m. Taiwan Standard Time on March 26, 2026, the submarine cable monitoring station at Tamsui registered the first anomaly. The APCN2 cable, one of 9 undersea fiber optic cables that carry approximately 8% of Taiwan's international internet traffic, went dark, not degraded. Dark. Total signal loss at a point 340 kilometers southwest of Taiwan, in waters that the People's Liberation Army Navy has been operating in for 11 days. By midnight, 2 more cables were cut. By 1 a.m., 4 more. By 2:17 a.m., when the last redundant cable, the SJC2, routed north toward Japan, lost signal, Taiwan's connection to the global internet had dropped from 23 terabits per second to 0.3 terabits per second. A reduction of 98.7%. The 0.3 terabits that remained came from Starlink terminals distributed across the island. At 3:58 a.m., Taiwanese operators began reporting that Starlink signals were degraded, not eliminated, but throttled to the point of near uselessness by what appeared to be coordinated GPS spoofing and electronic jamming across the frequencies Starlink uses for its phased array antennas. At 4 a.m. exactly, a time that was not accidental, the Taiwanese Presidential Office, the Ministry of National Defense, and the Central Bank of Taiwan simultaneously lost external communications. Taiwan had just become the most isolated democracy on Earth. And the military invasion had not yet begun. To understand why China did this before firing a single shot, you need to understand what the digital blockade is actually designed to accomplish. Because this is not about cutting off Netflix and social media. This is about destroying the 4 things that make modern democratic resistance possible: coordination, communication, financial stability, and the ability to tell the world what is happening. Let me walk through each one, because the sophistication of what China executed in 4 hours and 17 minutes is a military operation that has been in planning and preparation for at least 7 years. The undersea cables were not cut by accident and not by coincidence. The 9 cables that carry Taiwan's internet traffic run along routes that have been mapped, charted, and war-gamed by PLA Navy planners since at least 2017. Each cable has a known path, a known depth profile, and known repeater locations every 60 to 100 kilometers where the cable is most accessible and most vulnerable. The PLA Navy operates a fleet of cable-laying and cable repair vessels, vessels that, in peacetime, serve the legitimate function of maintaining undersea communication infrastructure. In the weeks preceding the blockade, 7 of those vessels conducted what Chinese state media described as routine maintenance exercises in the South China Sea and East China Sea. They were not doing maintenance. They were positioning. A cable-cutting operation at depth requires a remotely operated vehicle, a cutting tool, and knowledge of the cable's precise location. The PLA has all 3. The operation that severed 9 cables across a 400-kilometer arc in 4 hours required coordination across multiple vessels, pre-positioned at multiple points simultaneously. This was not improvised. This was executed. The Starlink jamming is the second layer. Taiwan has been distributing Starlink terminals since 2023 as an explicit contingency measure against exactly the cable-cutting scenario that just occurred. The Taiwanese government understood this vulnerability. They prepared for it. China prepared for their preparation. PLA electronic warfare units deployed jamming systems across the Taiwan Strait that target the specific frequency bands used by Starlink's phased array terminals. The jamming does not completely eliminate Starlink. It reduces throughput to approximately 2 to 5 megabits per second per terminal, compared to the normal 100 to 200 megabits. That is enough bandwidth to send a text message. It is not enough bandwidth to transmit military intelligence, coordinate logistics, process financial transactions, or broadcast to the world. And broadcasting to the world is precisely what China needed to prevent. Here is why information control is the first objective of this operation. Before a single ship moves toward Taiwan's coast, Taiwan's primary defense against Chinese military action is not its own military. Taiwan's military is capable and well-trained, but it is not capable of defeating the PLA in a sustained conventional conflict. Taiwan has 88,000 active duty military personnel. The PLA has 2 million. Taiwan's real defense is international opinion, American commitment, and the political cost that a televised invasion imposes on China globally. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the images that came out of Kyiv in the first 72 hours, the destroyed apartment buildings, the families sheltering in subway stations, the president addressing the nation from the streets of the capital, those images drove the international response. They drove the weapons deliveries, the sanctions packages, the political will to sustain support across 2 years of grinding attrition. China studied Ukraine. China understood that the images matter as much as the missiles. A digitally isolated Taiwan cannot broadcast those images. A digitally isolated Taiwan cannot coordinate its diaspora communities in the United States, Europe, and Japan, who would otherwise be organizing political pressure campaigns within hours of any military action. A digitally isolated Taiwan cannot provide real-time intelligence to American military forces that are trying to assess whether and how to respond. China did not cut Taiwan's cables to inconvenience 23 million people. China cut Taiwan's cables to control the narrative of what happens next in the 4 to 72 hours when narrative control matters most. If you understand why 4 hours of cable cutting may be more consequential than 4 weeks of missile strikes, subscribe right now, because the mainstream coverage is showing you cable route maps and Taiwanese government statements. It is not explaining the operational logic of information warfare as the first phase of a military campaign. Let me give you the numbers on what digital isolation actually means for a modern economy and military. Taiwan's financial system processes approximately $12 billion in daily transaction volume. The clearing infrastructure for those transactions runs through international networks, SWIFT, Visa, MasterCard, the correspondent banking system that require external internet connectivity to function. At 0.3% of normal bandwidth, those systems do not degrade, they stop. Within 6 hours of the blockade, Taiwan's central bank activated emergency protocols, switching to a domestic settlement system that operates on internal networks. That system can handle approximately 30% of normal daily transaction volume. The other 70% is queued, delayed, or simply not processing. In a society where payroll, supply chains, fuel procurement, and military logistics all depend on digital financial clearing, 70% transaction failure is not an inconvenience. It is the beginning of a supply chain collapse that compounds every day the blockade continues. Taiwan has approximately 30 days of fuel reserves. It has approximately 90 days of food reserves for its densest population centers. Those reserves exist precisely because Taiwanese planners have always understood the island's vulnerability to supply disruption. But accessing, distributing, and rationing those reserves requires logistics coordination. Logistics coordination requires communications. Communications require bandwidth that China has just reduced to 0.3% of normal. The reserves exist. The system to distribute them is running on a bandwidth equivalent to a 1990s dial-up modem. Now let me tell you what the United States is doing in the first 4 hours of this crisis, and why the response timeline reveals a gap that China calculated precisely. The USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group is currently positioned approximately 800 nautical miles east of Taiwan, conducting exercises in the Philippine Sea. At flank speed, the Ronald Reagan can cover 800 nautical miles in approximately 40 hours. The USS Carl Vinson is in Yokosuka, Japan, approximately 1,100 nautical miles from Taiwan, also 40 to 50 hours at flank speed. Both strike groups have been ordered to move toward Taiwan. Both will arrive in approximately 2 days. China's military planners know exactly where those ships are. They have been tracking them continuously for weeks. The 40-hour window between digital blockade and American carrier arrival is not a coincidence in Chinese operational planning. It is the operational window, 40 hours of information isolation, 40 hours during which Taiwan cannot clearly communicate its situation to the world. 40 hours during which the PLA can position amphibious assault forces, establish air superiority over the Taiwan Strait, and create facts on the ground that American carriers arriving on hour 41 will have to decide whether to contest or accept. This is the operational concept, not shock and awe, not a blitzkrieg. A carefully staged sequence in which each phase creates the conditions for the next phase, and the United States is always reacting to completed facts rather than preventing them. Let me tell you what Washington is saying, and where the statement ends and the hard problem begins. The White House issued a statement within 2 hours of the blockade becoming confirmed, calling it an unprecedented act of aggression against a democratic partner and warning of severe consequences if China proceeds with any military action against Taiwan. The Secretary of State convened emergency calls with allies. NATO issued a statement of concern. Japan declared a national security emergency. Here is what none of those statements change. The cables are cut. They cannot be uncut by a statement. Repairing undersea cables requires cable ships, which require weeks of preparation, which require access to waters that the PLA Navy currently controls. The fastest realistic timeline for restoring even partial cable connectivity is 6 to 8 weeks, assuming the PLA allows repair vessels to operate, which it has given no indication of doing. The Starlink jamming cannot be ended by a statement. It can be countered by deploying different frequencies, different waveforms, different approaches, but each countermeasure takes days to weeks to develop and deploy at scale, and China's electronic warfare units will adapt to each countermeasure in a cycle that favors the jammer over the signal. And the carriers are 40 hours away. Here are the 3 options the United States is now facing. All of them have serious problems. Option 1, accelerate carrier deployment and signal credible military commitment to Taiwan's defense. Move both strike groups at maximum speed, pre-position submarines in the Taiwan Strait, activate the defense commitment under the Taiwan Relations Act. The problem, credible military commitment requires the willingness to fight a war against a nuclear-armed peer adversary over a strait that China considers its sovereign territory. Every war game the Pentagon has conducted on this scenario in the last 10 years has produced the same conclusion. The United States can defeat China in a Taiwan Strait conflict, but at a cost in ships, aircraft, and personnel that no administration has been willing to publicly commit to. And China knows those war game results. The credibility of the commitment depends on whether Beijing believes Washington will pay that cost. After 4 other strategic defeats in the Middle East in the same month, that belief is at its lowest point in decades. Option 2, cyber and electronic warfare response. Attempt to restore Taiwan's communications through American assets. Deploy additional Starlink capacity. Activate military communications satellites. Use electronic warfare aircraft to suppress PLA jamming. The problem, American military communications satellites have finite bandwidth. Allocating significant capacity to Taiwan means reducing capacity elsewhere, including in the Middle East, where American forces are currently conducting active operations. Electronic warfare suppression of PLA jamming requires aircraft operating close to Chinese territory, which are themselves subject to Chinese air defense systems. Each layer of the response creates a new vulnerability. Option 3, diplomatic off-ramp, emergency communication to Beijing, offering negotiated resolution that preserves Taiwanese autonomy in exchange for Chinese commitment to halt further action. The problem? China cut 9 undersea cables and deployed electronic warfare across the Taiwan Strait because it calculated that the diplomatic and military response would be insufficient to reverse the action. Offering negotiations after the cables are cut confirms that calculation. It tells Beijing that the first move worked and that the next move will also be met with an offer to talk. There is no option here that restores the pre-blockade situation. Every available response either accepts the new reality or risks a war that the United States has spent a decade trying to avoid. Here is what you need to understand as we close. China just demonstrated that you can isolate a democracy of 23 million people from the global internet in 4 hours and 17 minutes, using vessels that were conducting maintenance exercises the week before. The operation cost China approximately $200 million in assets and preparation, cable-cutting ROVs, electronic warfare deployment, operational coordination. The cost to Taiwan, $12 billion in daily financial transactions disrupted. Military coordination degraded. Narrative control surrendered in the critical first 72 hours, and a digital isolation that will last 6 to 8 weeks minimum regardless of what happens diplomatically or militarily. Cost-exchange ratio, 1 to 60 in China's favor, before a single soldier has crossed the strait. Every military planner in Taipei, Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington is now solving a problem they have wargamed but never faced in reality. How do you defend a democracy that cannot communicate with the outside world, cannot coordinate its own logistics, and cannot show the world what is being done to it? The answer to that question will determine whether Taiwan is still a democracy in 6 months. And China is betting that Washington does not have a good answer ready. share this video, because the coverage will show you cable route maps and carrier strike group positions and statements from allied governments. It will not explain why 40 hours is the operational window. It will not tell you that cable repair takes 6 to 8 weeks minimum. It will not do the math on what 0.3% bandwidth means for a society that runs on digital financial clearing. They will give you the version where American carriers arrive and the situation stabilizes. I just gave you the version where China planned for the carriers and built a 4-hour head start into an operation that will be decided before the Ronald Reagan gets within strike range. 4 hours and 17 minutes, 9 cables, 23 million people, and a 40-hour window that China has been planning to use for 7 years.